All right, welcome back to our regular viewers, and thank you for joining us for our sixth episode of the season. If you are new to our podcast, a new peer ally, or new to the workforce, we're glad we found you. This podcast is for behavioral health clients and consumers, advocates, allies, peer support workers, community health workers, and community stakeholders, where we talk about advocacy, recovery, peer support, and provide education related to legislative changes to statewide policy to empower you as a client, consumer, or ally to lift up your voice as a stakeholder in the public behavioral health system. With me today are my wonderful team.
I'm Jocelyn.
I'm Grace.
And I'm Nicole. Today, we are going to discuss best practices for interpretation and translation and how it correlates to advocacy within the peer workforce. So let's dive right in. So I actually am going to invite our program coordinator, Jocelyn Farrell, to share with us her expertise in this area. So Jocelyn, what kind of experience do you have related to this topic?
So before I started working for nonprofits, I used to be a high school Spanish teacher. I've also taught English as a second language to all different ages and levels, both here in the United States as well as abroad. And then in order to become a Spanish teacher, my college education was focused heavily on language acquisition theory. It's still one of my favorite topics to nerd out about. I love it. And then I've also lived abroad a couple of times as well, when I was at different levels of Spanish fluency. And so I do have that personal experience as well of navigating healthcare settings in my non-native language.
Awesome. Yeah, so we mentioned we'll be discussing interpretation and translation. So are interpretation and translation one and the same, or is there a difference between the two?
So technically, there are two distinct things. Translation involves written communication and interpretation involves spoken communication. But for the sake of our conversation today, I'm going to be using those terms pretty interchangeably. And that's partly because in real life, if you are working with somebody in another language, you'll probably be doing a mix of both translation and interpretation. And because a lot of what we talk about today is going to be applicable to both of those.
Awesome.
It sounds like a lot to navigate, translating and interpreting at the same time. And also, as we look ahead, we live in an era with a lot of technological tools. In light of that, why is it important to use live human translators?
So AI is a really incredible tool. It's become very accurate in the last few years, and it's only becoming more accurate in its translations. But when we suggest that AI translation could replace human translation, that implies that translation is really nothing more than just taking words in one language and then finding their equivalent in another language. But it's actually a lot more complex than that because a translation can be accurate in terms of its actual dictionary definition of the words, but it can be functionally inaccurate if it's not capturing the cultural nuance behind those words. So let's say that you have a Puerto Rican client, they are Spanish speaking, and they are reporting that they are having un ataque de nervios. And a literal translation of that phrase would be that they are having an attack of nerves. And that is technically correct in terms of the dictionary definition, but that phrase doesn't capture what this means to a Puerto Rican, right? That phrase encompasses different symptoms than what we think of as an attack of nerves. It also encompasses their beliefs about those systems, the cultural and relational implications of what they're experiencing. And none of that can really be captured with just like an online AI translator. That requires somebody who actually knows and understands the culture to be able to communicate and translate that accurately. Another downside or limitation of AI is that anytime that you insert a machine in between human to human interaction, that's going to degrade the quality of that human interaction. Anytime you put words through a machine, words basically just become data rather than words being a way that you're establishing connection and rapport with another person. It's the same reason why if I were to say you could have the chance between spending an hour in real life with your best friend or spending an hour texting them, many of you would probably choose to spend an hour in real life with them, right? Because any time that you put a machine or technology in between that interaction, that human quality is lost. So all of this to say, AI is a really incredible tool in an emergency situation. If you don't have a translator, by all means, use it, take advantage of these tools, but it cannot actually replace a trained live human translator who understands the culture and the nuance.
Totally. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I think no one wants to miss that connection piece of the translation and interpretation. Technology can be super helpful, but human to human interaction is so important. Um, so, what kind of things might be missed, or what kind of errors could occur without the use of a translator?
So when we talk about how we're feeling, we often use something called idioms of distress, and those are defined as culturally shaped ways of expressing suffering, especially psychological or emotional suffering. So let's say that I come to you and I tell you that I'm feeling blue and my heart is heavy and I can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. So even though I'm not actually in a tunnel right now, even though my heart weighs the same as it always has, even though saying that I am feeling a color, doesn't actually make a whole lot of sense. Um, if you're a native English speaker, you're going to hear me and you're going to understand that I'm telling you that I'm feeling sad and hopeless, maybe feeling a little bit of despair. So I never actually used those words, but I used idioms of distress, and those are very effective between native speakers of a language. What's important to understand about idioms of distress, though, is first, they rely on shared cultural understanding. And second, they communicate our cultural beliefs. So let's take a look at that expression, I can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. First, that relies on our shared cultural understanding of light being representative of hope. So if you're not from a culture that equates light with hope, then we can put this phrase into your language, but it's not going to make any sense at all. And then this phrase also communicates our underlying belief that suffering should be temporary, right? So in Western society, we believe that when we experience hardship, we should be able to look ahead, look forward into the future, and see hope. And when we can't, that's when it becomes problematic. All of that is embedded into that phrase. But let's imagine now that I'm living in another country as an immigrant and I want to express these symptoms to a healthcare provider, but in another language. Best case scenario, I recognize that these phrases aren't really going to translate very well. So I just stick to very limited vocabulary in another language and I just say that I'm sad and I'm tired. So it kind of gets the point across, but not fully. And that's best case scenario. Worst case scenario, I still use these phrases that I'm used to using in my own language, and I end up completely misunderstood. So the provider is going to be wondering what I'm doing talking about tunnels in the first place. But then they might hear that I'm saying that my heart feels heavy, and suddenly I get referred to a cardiologist for them to look into my chest pain. So I'm misunderstood, I'm possibly misdiagnosed, and ultimately I get the wrong care all because of these language barriers and because of words not translating the same way from one language to the next.
So, looking at everything that you just expressed, we're looking at accuracy. So, besides impacting the accuracy of the information, how might not using a translator impact the client's own experience of sharing?
So this comes down to some of the neuroscience behind language and being bilingual. And I do want to give a disclaimer here that this is a very nuanced topic, so I'm going to be speaking in very broad generalizations here when I'm talking about the science. But when you acquire your first language as a baby, you acquire it through social and emotional and sensory experiences. And so as a result, your first language is very much intertwined with those experiences. And so when you're speaking your first language, the parts of your brain involved in emotional memory are activated. If you learn an additional language later in life, this other language tends to be encoded much more abstractly. And so when you're speaking it, those parts of your brain involved in emotion aren't lighting up in the same way. The implication of this is that if you're relaying your own experience to someone in your second language, it's going to feel more like you're just narrating a character's life rather than describing your own personal emotional experiences. And there are times when this could be helpful. So you might want that emotional distance if you're trying to communicate something um, really traumatic that's really overwhelming to talk about. In those times, you might want to dampen that emotional experience while you're sharing. But overall, this emotional distancing is going to be more of a hindrance when you're trying to share. Another thing along the same lines is that your first language is highly integrated with your identity. There's something called the default mode network, or the DMN, which is a set of brain regions that are involved in self-referential thought. And so the DMN becomes activated anytime you're doing any kind of internally focused thought. So if you are kind of self-reflecting, or even if you're just daydreaming, thinking about goals or your future. And then the DMN is suppressed during tasks that require some kind of focus or problem solving. But what's really fascinating here is that the research shows that the DMN is more strongly engaged in your first language than your second language, meaning that your first language is highly associated with your own sense of identity and with self-referential thinking. But when you switch over to your second language, your brain starts relying more on the parts that are involved in completing tasks or solving problems.
Interesting. That I feel like I'm learning so much from you, Jocelyn. This is such valuable information. So what are the implications of this?
So yeah, what this means is that when you're speaking your second language, you're in a more deliberate, externally focused neural mode rather than being in an automatic, internally grounded one. And so that shift creates a feeling of stepping outside yourself, almost like you're observing your emotional state rather than actually inhabiting your own emotional state. Essentially, you're quieting down the neural systems that make you feel like yourself, and you're boosting the ones that make you just feel like you're completing a task or solving a problem.
So, when someone's trying to share something deeply personal in their second language, their whole brain is working differently. What kind of effort does that take behind the scenes?
So, speaking a second language activates a part of your brain that's involved in inhibitory control, which has really fascinating implications. So let's say, for example, that I see the word PAN. I'm a native English speaker, and so I see that. I know it spells pan. And so my brain connects those letters to the concept of a frying pan sitting on a stove. But I also know Spanish, and so I know that it spells pan as well, meaning bread. So if I am reading a text in Spanish, my brain has to suppress or inhibit its instinct to read that as pan in my first language in order to make room for that problem-solving part of my brain that can say, no, wait a second, actually it spells pan this time. So this is all going on in my brain for one single word. When you're operating in your second language, this process is happening constantly. So the part of your brain that knows how to inhibit interference from your native language and from automatic processes is in overdrive. And the part of your brain that knows how to communicate spontaneously is being suppressed.
Interesting. Okay, so what does this actually mean when you're sitting across from someone trying to share your life story and communicate your emotional state to them in your second language? Is that very detached and harder to do?
Yeah, you're going to be incredibly limited in what you can share. You won't be able to share as spontaneously or as automatically because of this inhibition. What you do share will be very devoid of emotion because of what I talked about earlier, with those emotional parts of your brain being separate. So you're going to be speaking more like you're narrating someone else's experiences. You don't really even feel like yourself. The part of your brain that knows how to inhibit you is constantly engaged, which is really counterproductive in a setting where you're actually wanting to be able to share openly. But then if you add a translator to the situation, this becomes a completely different story. You're getting to speak in your own native language, meaning the parts of your brain that are involved in emotion are actually lighting up again. So you're better able to communicate those emotional states. You actually feel like yourself again rather than just feeling like an observer of your emotional states. And all of that's going to lead to being able to share more authentically, more effectively, in a more emotionally rich way, and in a way that actually reflects who you are and your core identity and what matters to you.
It's so interesting to see how if you're, for instance, if you were going to see your provider and you're not able to effectively communicate your emotional state in your native language, how not only that's affecting you, but not able to receive the support and treatment that is proper for your current scenario because you're not able to connect with the provider in that way. So that's very, very interesting and something I haven't necessarily thought of very often. So it's really nice to hear that from you, Jocelyn, your perspective on and your knowledge on all of this.
Yeah, it's very easy to think like, oh, somebody knows enough of the language. We don't actually need an interpreter.
Right,
But just knowing enough of the language to get by isn't necessarily enough to fully communicate and have that authentic experience.
right.
Yeah, Joss, you bring a whole different perspective. Just when I'm thinking of my privilege and being able to go into talk to a doctor and share what I'm experiencing, even if I can't find the right words, I can get that feeling that the doctor is still understanding what I'm saying in spite of the loss of those words. And so, again, just looking at my own privilege of being able to walk in and walk out of a doctor's office and have some sense, not always having the answers, but maybe some answers. And just now, when I go in to doctor's offices or looking for ways to support my own mental health and physical health, I'm really also going to be thinking of these situations for individuals who are trying to go into offices where it's scary, it's intimidating, it's cold, it may not be inviting for them a lot of the time. So I really appreciate this new perspective that you've brought to this, Jocelyn. It's such an interesting topic to explore, and we want to continue this conversation as this further demonstrates the need for language accessibility within the California public behavioral health system, especially with coming from such a large, diverse state. And now that we know why using competent translators is important, we want to dive into how and what are some best practices for translation. So, we want to invite you to join us for part two of this podcast as we invite one of our team members to share their best practices and personal anecdotes based on their expertise within the peer workforce. Additionally, we want to share some events that are coming up. Our quarterly training webinar is on December 2nd. So, depending on if we can get this podcast up and out to everyone before then, or if not, the recording would be available through our YouTube channel. We have a policy update that is coming up after the new year. Actually, we'll have a two-parter because we will have a live in-person policy update during our annual statewide conference that is scheduled for January 23rd. And if you aren't able to join us in person for that event, we're really excited about. We also will have that uploaded after our event on January 23rd. So please, if you're interested in attending our annual conference and learning more about it, we'll have a link available soon. And please, we ask that you continue following this podcast as we may share information for a call to action from time to time. And we just want you to join us to help advocate if you feel so moved on certain topics. New this month, also, we released a podcast poll. If you missed it or didn't get a chance to respond, we invite you to follow our social media pages on Instagram and Facebook, where we will continue to Now, post more often our questions. We are hoping to engage you as a listener and share with us the questions that you have based on the topics that we're going to be talking about. And finally, please share this podcast with peers, families, and friends to help share this vital information with those who want to learn more about peer support, recovery, advocacy, legislative changes, and statewide policy.
Yes, thank you, Nicole. So, yes, please join us next month for part 2 of this episode. We thank you for listening, and we really look forward to hearing from you as we continue those online polls. We really want to find out what you want to hear, what you want to know more about. So, please engage with those when you get a chance, and we will see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.